Thank you for joining Jennifer Strauss and Associates in our 2019 Webinar Wednesday series. We are coming to you live from downtown Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday, and you can find the upcoming schedule on our website. Past webinars and all recordings are on our website on our YouTube channel, along with over 160 other recordings on federal contracting topics. All are complimentary. If you have questions for our speaker today, you can email her directly. The contact information you'll see on the last slide. Right, this is just a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C. based firm and provide services for federal contractors. This ranges from market analysis reports to proposal writing and also post-award compliance. More information is on our website, so please visit us there. And these are a couple of events that you can find more information on our website. We do offer newsletter advertising, so you can send an email to this email if you'd like more information on that. All right, our speaker today is Noelle Slifka. She's going to be covering selling commercial items to DOD, current environment. Noelle, thank you for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I am Noelle Slifka, a government contracts attorney in private practice in Connecticut. And today's webinar will cover the current environment when selling commercial items to the U.S. Department of Defense. Next slide. So back in the 1990s, Congress recognized that federal government purchases of commercial items and services should not be a difficult and lengthy process. There were many examples of overly burdensome military specifications, causing common items to be too costly when purchased by DOD. In addition, DOD was shut out of business with commercial companies who could not produce detailed cost information to support the prices of commercial items. So Congress passed FASA, the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act, and the Clinger-Cohen Act to simplify the process, the terms and conditions, and pricing requirements for commercial item purchases for all of the federal government, based on the bad experiences for military purchases in some cases. So what has happened since the mid-1990s when FASA and Clinger-Cohen were passed? Well, since 2001, the United States has been fighting multiple wars over extended periods of time, and defense spending in the last 2 decades has significantly grown from the drawdown of the 1990s when FASA and Clinger-Cohen were passed. When a lot of money is spent, some proportion of it is perceived to be spent unwisely and even fraudulently. So investigations of how the money has been spent tend to happen, and with investigations tend to come some shocking stories of overcharging. Also significant is that the U.S. military operates many aging products, particularly aircraft. And when I say aging, I don't mean that they're not well maintained, but they simply are products that have been purchased, in some cases several decades ago, and they're still in operation today. Many of the aircraft and subsystems were based on commercially available technology. And in fact, transport aircraft in particular were purchased by the military decades ago, and many of those are still in operation today. And many are based on commercially available technology and commercial products that were in use in general aviation, commercial transport, and cargo transport back when the purchases were made. The military is still flying and maintaining the same aircraft, while the commercial marketplace has moved on to newer models. Typically, a commercial operator of an aircraft flies much more than the military. They have different flying profiles. The military might fly in harsher environments and cause slightly different wear and tear on the product. But often a commercial operator flies the aircraft much more than the military. And so therefore the aircraft gets retired earlier. So the military is still flying and maintaining the same aircraft while the commercial marketplace has moved on to newer models. And commercial sources for parts and services still exist. But often the military is seeking not even last year's model, but last decade's model of commercial products. There's also been a lot of consolidation in the industries that support the military, particularly among manufacturers. So consolidation means fewer sources, especially for the older commercial parts that DoD is often seeking to maintain their fleets of aircraft, trucks, and the like. So fewer sources means less competition and more sole source buys of commercial items and services. On the flip side, though, there's another force that's shaping the current environment of commercial item buying at DoD, and that's the need for new technology and different capabilities. Some of the new technology that DoD needs is not necessarily available from the contractors that have traditionally done business with DoD, or at least that's the perception. The perception is that DoD really needs to engage a different set of industry to get new technologies and different capabilities to fight the wars, not only of today, tomorrow, but the future. So DoD has been seeking to attract different businesses to sell to them. And the concern is that companies not experienced with the federal acquisition regulation clauses and the defense FAR supplement clauses, let alone concepts like cost or pricing data and unlimited rights and intellectual property, that those companies will avoid business with DoD, and the military will be shut out of the best solutions that the commercial market has to offer the warfighter. So in short, the military needs stuff from the commercial marketplace, but the process of selling to DoD is still off-putting to commercial companies, to say the least. Next slide. One of the significant shapers of the current environment when selling commercial items to DoD is the DoD Inspector General's office. No discussion of the current environment of commercial item acquisition by DoD can be complete without discussing DoD IG's office and their audits and reports on commercial items. So among other things, the DoD IG investigates fraud, waste, and abuse involved in DoD contracting. And since the mid-2000s, about a decade after FASA and Clear-Cohen were passed, the DoD IG has written a series of reports about commercial item contracts that the office has audited. The vast majority of those reports involve aircraft spare parts and maintenance. So I mentioned that there is an aging fleet within the government for aircraft, and I mentioned aircraft in particular because a lot of the DoD IG reports have been about aircraft spare parts and maintenance. Why? Well, DoD, particularly the Air Force and the Defense Logistics Agency, and to a lesser extent the Army, they spend a lot of money on aircraft support. They have a very large fleet, and aircraft are very expensive to operate and maintain. In addition, many aircraft in the U.S. military fleet are based on commercial technology or contain commercial parts. There has been consolidation in the industry, and typically when a part needs to be replaced, there's only one manufacturer that sells that particular part. In general, when you're designing an acquisition of an overall system, it is easier to put out requirements to allow for competition. When you have to replace a single spare part, you really need to buy that particular part and that particular part number because the government is not going to redesign the product in order to foster more competition. So often there's really only one source for these parts. So a lot of money is being spent on commercial items from sole source suppliers, and that is the perfect storm. Since 2006, the DoD IG has released around a dozen reports critical of contracting for commercial items, specifically the prices paid. The main theme running through the DoD IG reports is that getting cost data is the only way to ensure that the government is paying a fair and reasonable price. So I have mentioned in the past in a prior webinar that there's a balancing act when you buy commercial items for the government. There's access to technology and parts and services that the commercial marketplace has to offer. And on the flip side, there's a tension with trying to get access to the cost in order to evaluate the prices. The most recent report focused from the DoD IG's office focused on purchases from TransDigm, which is a supplier of aircraft parts. Contracts with multiple different companies have been the subject of DoD IG reports, frankly, too many to cover in this short webinar. So I don't mean to single out any one company in mentioning TransDigm, but I do think that DoD IG report and what followed that report is really emblematic of the DoD IG's concerns regarding contractor exemptions from providing cost data, including for commercial item acquisition. So if you read no other report, I would read the TransDigm report just to see the flavor of the criticisms that the DoD IG office has. So TransDigm sold aircraft parts under many contracts with DoD entities. The DoD IG reviewed a sample of 47 parts for price reasonableness, most of which were exempt from cost data, either due to dollar threshold exemption, so they were under the threshold for certified cost or pricing data, which is currently $2 million. I believe at the time of the audit, it was $750,000. And in fact, many of the purchases were under the simplified acquisition threshold, which is $150,000. Or the acquisitions were exempt from certified cost of pricing data due to the commercial item exemption. So although the TransDigm report is not only about commercial item acquisition, there is an aspect of commercial item acquisition inherent in the report. And I think a lot of the criticisms are equally those that the DOD-IG has raised with respect to commercial item acquisition over the years. So the DOD-IG performed a cost analysis of selected parts and determined that any price with profit in excess of 15% was excessive. So just note that there are, with limited exceptions for certain types of cost reimbursement contracts, there's no prescribed profit rate for DOD contractors under the regulations. The DOD has selected 15% as their threshold for what is reasonable, based on an analysis of certain profit rates for other DLA contracts. And in general, I think their position is that anything above 15% is unreasonable. Following release of the report, there were congressional hearings, and under pressure, TransDigm actually returned $16 million to the government based on the DOD-IG's calculation of excess profits that were earned by the company. So anything over 15% based on the cost analysis that the IG's office did for a selection of parts. They then took that selection of parts and extrapolated that across all of the contracts and came to a figure of $16 million in excess profits, which TransDigm has now repaid. In addition to that, DOD issued a memo directing that all sole source acquisitions from TransDigm affiliated companies must include the submission of uncertified cost data. So no matter the dollar figure, TransDigm affiliated companies will now be required to submit uncertified cost data for any sole source sales. I think of particular note is that these contracts were awarded consistent with current regulations governing commercial item purchases by DOD and other purchases by DOD under the cost of pricing data threshold and under the simplified acquisition threshold. And there were no laws broken. The DOD-IG report, along with others in the series of reports on commercial items, just concluded that in the absence of data from the offeror on how much it costs to manufacture commercial items, the government will overpay. Next slide. So the DOD-IG reports focus on one end of the spectrum of commercial purchases by DOD, and that's really, they're focused on sole source parts that have to get acquired for mostly for older products. On the other end of the spectrum, of course, is that DOD must continue to keep, they have to continue to buy tomorrow's needs for the Defense Department, that some of those needs may only be found in the commercial marketplace. A few key legislative and regulatory authorities are assisting DOD with attracting commercial companies to do business with DOD. And one of those is Other Transaction Authority, or the authority to enter into other transaction agreements, or OTAs. OTAs are not covered by the Federal Acquisition Regulation or the DoD-FARS supplement. And they're also not covered by the pricing rules and requirements for cost of pricing data. OTAs can only be used in certain instances and only when the government has authority to buy certain types of goods and services under an OTA. So they're not a panacea, since the agreements must fit the authorities that DoD has to award OTAs. For certain types of R&D and prototype purchases, OTAs may be available. For follow-on production purchases, that may or may not be possible under an OTA. And at a certain point, products that begin to be purchased under an OTA may ultimately have to be purchased under a FAR-based procurement for follow-on purchases. And there may be a rude awakening when they transition away from sort of the more permissive rules of an OTA environment to a FAR-based contract. Nevertheless, in order to attract non-traditional companies, as well as small businesses, DoD has been using OTAs to do business with DoD. In reaction to concerns that companies without a history of selling to DoD will be reluctant to start, and that may be where the next technology wave will come from, Congress passed legislation that was implemented in DFARS 212.102 that allows purchases from non-traditional defense contractors to be treated as commercial item purchases. A non-traditional defense contractor is an entity that is not currently and has not performed a contract subject to full cost accounting standards coverage, CAS coverage, for the 1 year prior to the solicitation. So a non-traditional defense contractor, it's not about what they're selling, it's about who they are and what other types of contracts they have. And if they do not have a full CAS covered contract and during the past year prior to the solicitation, they're considered a non-traditional defense contractor, even if they have been doing some DOD contracting. If they're considered a non-traditional defense contractor, purchases from them may be treated as commercial items, regardless of what is being purchased. But the DFARS goes on to state that there is no commercial item determination that's required, and that the item is not necessarily commercial, but that the commercial item procedures may be used, including presumably exemptions from certified cost of pricing data. So OTAs, defining certain contractors as non-traditional defense contractors, is really in part an attempt to open up the marketplace for DOD in an attempt to get other businesses rather than the traditional businesses to be willing to do business with DOD and make sure that DOD has access to the latest technologies. This is the other end of the spectrum versus sort of the DODIG's review of older spare parts that are being purchased by DOD. Next slide. So if the DODIG reports represent one end of the spectrum of treatment of commercial items, and then attempts to entice commercial companies to do business with DOD represent the other end by sort of waiving off the contract processes that would otherwise be required, is there anything in the middle that is trying to bridge the gap and allow purchases of commercial items at fair and reasonable prices under the commercial rules? Well, the DCMA, the Defense Contract Management Agency, a few years ago stood up a commercial item group. The SIG, the commercial item group, was created to bridge the gap and support contracting officers struggling with purchases of commercial items, put more consistency into the process, and help by collecting data and using that data, market data, to be able to analyze whether something is commercial and whether the price is reasonable. The SIG is a cadre of experts that's referred to in DFARS Part 212 with authority to make commercial item determinations, not just recommendations. They can actually make determinations and evaluate price reasonableness. The SIG doesn't negotiate prices, but they can make a determination of whether something's commercial, and then they can evaluate the price. And then the negotiating would be left to the contracting officer. The SIG, however, in evaluating price reasonableness, they use market research. They use information that they've collected in an internal database to determine whether an offered price for a commercial item or service is reasonable. A note on the internal database. They have an internal database that has a lot more information than an externally available database that just provides some summary information about which types of parts they have actually done a review of for commerciality. So if you're concerned about whether by being the subject of a SIG analysis, your company's detailed information would be available on the web externally facing, it will not. But some of that information may ultimately be used internally by DOD in order to build upon their skills and be able to use the best available information within the government to make commercial item determinations and evaluate price reasonableness. Currently, the SIG will only take requests to get involved from the contracting officer and not directly from industry. And in fact, because there's a $1 million threshold for a written determination for a DOD acquisition of a commercial item, the SIG will only look at purchases of commercial items above $1 million. And they will only take that request from the contracting officer. However, they will look at not only prime contracts, but subcontracts for commerciality and price reasonableness if requested by the contracting officer. So if you're in industry and you feel you've reached a roadblock on a particular sale based on a disagreement about commerciality or price reasonableness, discuss with the contracting officer whether it would be appropriate for the contracting officer to raise that issue to the SIG. The SIG is now up to, I think, full employment, over 60 people at different locations across the country. And so there may be an opportunity, contracting officer permitting, to have that situation brought to the SIG. DOD has also recently updated its commercial item guidebook. There was an older version of a commercial item guidebook that was available on the web that was developed with industry input and comment as well. This latest version of the commercial item guidebook was also developed with industry comment, and it is available. It's a two-part guidebook, and it's available on the Defense Pricing and Contracting website. So if you Google commercial item guidebook DOD, it will pop up. Next slide. So what are the key takeaways? Those are the tips to get DOD what it needs from the commercial marketplace and avoid becoming the subject of a DOD IG report or bad newspaper headlines. Well, whether you're working for the government or industry, one of the keys is to gather information available on prices for similar products or services, understand the market, and be willing to discuss the information. That's for both sides. Is really do that market research, understand what it is that you're selling, understand where that pricing fits within the market, and be willing to use that information to discuss. The government has a lot of purchasing information at its disposal. And when it comes to military hardware, DOD is the single largest buyer in the world. One of the themes that came through in these recent DOD IG reports over the years has been that somehow the government has been exploited by contractors by a lack of information or an unequal playing field in terms of information. But the idea that a single company selling commercial parts can't be matched at the bargaining table by the single largest buyer of military hardware in the world is really unfathomable. Get the data, use it to negotiate. Another key takeaway is to avoid the endless loop of requesting more and more data from the contractor and never getting to the negotiating table. What I've seen over the years in my work is that often there's a request for data and another request for data, and it's clear that the government doesn't trust or feel confident in the price that the contractor is offering. It's clear that the government doesn't think it's fair and reasonable, but there isn't necessarily a counteroffer coming back to explain, well, where does the government think the price should be? And so the negotiations really come to a standstill. In fact, they haven't started because there isn't that back and forth of pricing and offers going across the table. An offer can always be countered, and contractors should expect that and be willing to negotiate. A take it or leave it approach doesn't work, and contractors should be willing to negotiate their prices based on information. Too often, however, the process gets paralyzed in requests for more information to support a price that the government clearly doesn't believe is reasonable. So I think really in the end, both parties have to think about the fact that data is for the purposes of informing negotiations. Data is not an end unto itself. So use the data, get the data, but then get to the negotiations. Finally, the goal is a fair and reasonable price. It's not necessarily the lowest price possible, and it definitely is not the highest price that a contractor can get away with. The reason why I think a lot of the companies have ended up, or their contracts have ended up the subject of DOD IG reports, is that contractors may have forgotten to evaluate their pricing against a standard of reasonableness and fairness. And not only with respect to the price, look at the history of price increases, look at the market, look at whether there are other sources available, look at things like acquisitions in the market and consolidation in the market. If a contractor is representing a company that has made a lot of acquisitions and consolidation in the market, and now there's really only one place for the government to go to get a particular type of part, if at the same time that company is raising its prices, that can spell disaster, and that's what becomes ultimately, big fodder for the DOD IG reviewing that and saying that the company, in not only consolidating but raising their prices around the same time, is abusing their place in the market. So always evaluate prices against a standard of reasonableness and fairness, and doing so will lessen the chances of ending up the subject of a newspaper headline. So we've reached the end of the webinar. I want to thank you today. Please email me your questions, and good luck with selling commercial items to DOD.
Thank you, Noelle, for joining us today. And like she said, if you have any questions, contact her. And this concludes the webinar. Thank you, everybody.